Welcome to the scientific inquiry into hydraulic fracturing in the Northern Territory. If you could please state your names and who you are appearing on behalf of or for today. Thank you.
My name is Larissa Baldwin, and I'm the Co-National Director of the SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network.
Thank you.
My name is Vanessa. I'm a Southern Arundel woman from like 100k South Alice Springs, and I'm a volunteer with SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Vanessa Farrelly, that is.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. What do you want to tell the inquiry today?
Yeah, so we're from an organisation called SEED, which is Australia's first Indigenous Youth Climate Network. So we're a network of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people standing up to protect country from the causes and impacts of climate change. And so that's thinking about how climate change impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and especially in northern and central Australia. From like rising sea levels in the Torres Strait to increased bushfires and floods and droughts that hit our communities, especially remote communities who have less access to services. And also climate change is about our land, and because that's what's going to be affected. And if anything's going to happen to our land, you need to involve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's our rights to control the thing that's most important to us. And basically, it's like so often there are not enough services in our communities already, and not enough health services, not enough disaster relief, not enough housing, and climate change is just going to exacerbate all of those pre-existing issues. So this is something that definitely is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. And where I'm from, like by 2050, I've heard that the temperature could rise by 20 degrees, which is massive for people living on outstations with, not access to the kind of housing to prepare themselves for that. It's basically going to mean a mass kind of scale removal of people off their country and off their land, because it's just not hospitable for us to live there anymore. So that's about our culture, and it's about our survival as a people, and so it definitely concerns us. And then SEED also kind of traces that back to what causes climate change and how that impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people again, and that's fossil fuel extraction on our land. And so that's why we got involved in, fracking in the Northern Territory, because fracking is going to contribute to climate change and make the impacts worse. And it's also 50% of the land in the Northern Territory is under some Aboriginal title. And so definitely it's about our rights, and it's about getting consent, and then it's about how that comes back and impacts us when the climate change impacts hit us.
So I guess when we see it as an organisation, our role, we feel, is to raise the awareness of climate change in community and talk to people about what's already happening, what the changes they can see, but also make sure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are empowered to raise their voice on this issue, because right now we can see a lot of the stuff that's happening around climate is dominated by non-Indigenous people, and it doesn't talk about how the impacts are going to happen in the Territory. In the last year alone, we've seen almost 2 degrees of warming. We've seen massive events like coral bleaching in Queensland. We've seen the massive mangrove die-off from the Gulf all the way to Weipa. And these are climate impacts that inevitably are going to impact us. When we first heard about the scale of the licences in the Territory, one of the reasons we came here is we're like, as young Aboriginal people, really sure that you could bet that the consultation hadn't happened with community, that there were going to be communities that were covered in these licences that they didn't know about it. So what we wanted to come up here and do is just try and reach out to communities, see what they knew, and also basically raise their concerns or empower communities to raise their concerns to government. So that's what we've been doing over the last year specifically in the NT. One of the things that came up, so we came up here to maybe find one community to work with, and what ended up happening is we were inundated by people who were just like, we haven't been informed about what's going to happen here. We know one of the principles that we talk about with working with SEED is like the UNN rights of Indigenous peoples, and that's to free, informed and prior consent. And there are so many instances that we've seen over the last year where people just don't have the information about what fracking is going to mean. We've seen it in the resources that have been provided to people. We've talked to elders, people who've said that when they were approached by these companies, they were told that the impact on land would be the size of a billy can. And we understand that in many places, interpreters weren't used. So there's a massive issue. And then once we actually explain to people what fracking is in language that they can understand, the size and scale of not just the fracking industry, but the fact of like how much land mass shale gas fields are going to cover. People are really concerned. They're concerned about, one, water. Two, they're concerned about the fact people know that they can only say yes to these agreements, yes and no to these agreements in the exploration stage. So that means during extraction, they have no right to say where these wells are going to be drilled. And obviously for Aboriginal people, where we have to deal with cultural heritage and looking after our land, this is a big issue for people. It's not up the companies for shale gas, because of where it's trapped and that sort of stuff. They aren't going to be able to set out a neat plan of where they're going to be able to drill. They have to drill where the gas is. And if Aboriginal people don't have a say in that, then it creates a lot of issues for people. We spent a lot of time up in Borroloola, where people have been dealing with the runoff and the pollution from the MacArthur River mine. And one of the things that people are talking about on the ground a lot is like, what if this does impact our water? People know that their water comes from ground sources, and people are really worried that this could be polluted. And I guess from from a more like Aboriginal-centric point of view, is just that we are a nation of people that have been removed from land, and we have dealt with over decades the removals from the stolen generation. There's a lot of trauma already in our community, and we've seen people are really worried, and we don't go into communities to be alarmists. What we want to do is give people information about what's happening, what shale gas fracking could mean for the country, and what what evidence we have. And a lot of the things that we can point to is stuff that's happened in the United States, some stuff that's happened in Mexico, where people have actually had to evacuate communities. And we know that for Aboriginal people, the actual evacuation from land, that would cause a great amount of trauma. And so when you actually look at, this industry is going to create some jobs, it's going to create some money, but, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we had the government produce a report on closing the gap that said that it wasn't, except for one key issue, it wasn't meeting, it wasn't closing the gap in a range of different issues. We see fracking in the Northern Territory because of the types of communities, because of these are our most remote, our most vulnerable communities. We see this as a huge risk that people aren't taking into consideration. So we think it's really important that Aboriginal people are consulted, and we really want to thank the panel for, we did really push for, in the stages of the last election, we really did push for Aboriginal people to get enrolled to vote, to lobby the government and say that their voice wasn't being heard on this issue. We also talked a lot about the fact that the government had promised a moratorium, so we're non-partisan organisation, so what we did provide was information about what people were proposing about fracking, who was pro-fracking and who was, I think ALP ultimately were saying that they'd put a pause on it and allow time for consultation. So we went around to a lot of communities throughout the Territory talking about the fact that this Territory election was going to be really important, having their voice heard. We've been doing a lot of work in the lead up to this panel, and so we're really grateful that this process had gone through. We've done a lot of lobbying with traditional owners, just making sure that they have the resources to come actually down to meet people and explain what their issues are. So for us, we know this is the first step, but we really want you to know that we are actually putting a lot of faith in this process, because so far the process that has been happening with the agreements and the land access agreements with companies, with the land councils, people aren't informed. The resources that they're getting are really terrible. They just don't go far enough to explain. And we understand, through this process, this is not the hearing process that you're going to get in remote communities, but I think in a lot of places, what we've seen from these companies is that they've actually used the fact that people have low literacy levels against them. We really feel like they're not being told the whole story. People are really worried about this and what it means. And it was one of the things that we heard about that came from the community when this panel was put together is where Aboriginal voices were going to be heard, and like whether or not the people on this panel were actually going to be able to understand what Aboriginal people were saying. So you might have noticed that there was a push to try and get some sort of Aboriginal representation on this panel. Yeah.
We also know that the gas that will be fracked will be like ultimately mainly for exports to either the East Coast or other countries. Basically that to me says that you're fracking my country and pumping a whole bunch of chemicals and sand and water into the ground and using our communities to get there for energy that we won't even see or use. Yeah, it's basically saying that our land and Aboriginal people in remote communities are just sacrifice zones for the rest of the world to continue their lifestyles, but at what expense to us?
Yeah. The other thing there has been some promises of jobs. One of the other things that we've read a lot into is basically what the fracking industry looks like when it's on communities. We've said that these are our most vulnerable communities, but actually what does it look like to have a high volume of FIFO workers coming into our communities? When we go out to communities, we went out to Farrelly at the beginning of the year last year, and we talked about, what communities wanted to see and try to give them some skills to talk to each other and explain that everybody needs to come together and decide what they want. And we, throughout this, have been inundated with young people, elders who would love to have jobs on community, but these aren't the type of jobs that are asked. They're being given to them, or options that they're being given to them by the governments. So it's like, if you have mining or you have nothing. There are many other ways that we know jobs could work in remote communities. We've seen an excellent inquiry into renewable energy and doing the pros and cons and the cost analysis of something like having remote community solar. It actually will provide jobs for a longer time. We know that fracking jobs only have the jobs are actually basically only while the well's being fracked, and then nothing. So one of the other things on jobs is that we've seen over the last year a huge amount of community support go behind People for Country, which is rangers coming back on country. And one of the reasons we really support this and have been working closely with that campaign is that we know that when we talk about mitigation and adaptation and climate change, our people have to be front and centre, because right now, in the situation that people are living, we're the least readily available. It's going to take us the most to adapt to climate change, whether the issues with housing and that sort of stuff, and extreme temperature rises. Over the last few weeks in the Northern Territory, we've seen a massive wet season. We've had very small wet seasons over the last couple of years, but we've seen a massive one. We've seen communities cut off. We have seen people have to get food drops in. Climate change means that these things are going to happen more often, and they're going to be more extreme. The impact on people is going to be greater. So even if you go back even 2 years ago when in Elko Island, when we had massive cyclones, we had that community 2 weeks without being able to get any sort of aid in. So climate change is really going to impact remote communities. And this isn't like the rest of the country where people are debating about climate change. When you go out to remote communities, we don't use the language of climate change. We talk about temperature variance. And one of the incredible things that we've talked about is the fact that a lot of old people talk about how they can track through their stories climate change and temperature variance. And now that they can prove that it's different, you could go out and we're not, lots of people say that we aren't scientists, but I believe that we are the first scientists. Through our stories, we have the data, we have the information that says that climate change is real and climate change is happening, and what is happening now is unprecedented. So when we go out into communities and explain to them how climate change happens, people understand that we need to actually play a role in providing and safeguarding our communities from the worst impacts of climate change. I guess the other thing, we've pretty much gone through everything. One of the other things we want to say to the inquiry is that we know that there has been an extension of where you're going to go to remote communities, but we feel like there are a bunch of remote communities that haven't been visited in this process, and we'd like to make sure that you get to hear from them as well. While we've touched on a bunch of things for that we've heard from remote communities, we actually really want to make sure that these people are at the panel, and so you can talk to them. So we will be doing a lot of work getting people to panels and making sure they're transported there, and you can hear from them directly. I think one of the other things that people need to know is that there is a lot of anger in Aboriginal communities about these permits and leases and agreements. People have been, one, lobbying government, but also there is a lot of legal action being taken because people don't feel like they were aware or that they're unsure. One of the stories that we heard is that there's an agreement that's been signed off for a lease and the community has been asking who signed it off, and they've got nothing from the land councils to validate this agreement. I don't want to go back too much into that, but you will hear that when you go to one of your visits, but that is going through a legal process. So it's just people don't feel like they know about fracking. They don't feel like they feel like this whole process of getting people to sign agreements and land access agreements has been really seeing these companies ride roughshod over communities. People are also really concerned about water, obviously, and also really concerned about fracking coming too close to very sacred areas and that sort of thing. So over the process of the last year, we have seen unprecedented amounts of. We've had even police say to us when we've been marching down the streets of Mataranka, they've never seen so many Aboriginal people come out and turn out to a rally and that sort of stuff. And we've had incredible community support. I don't think I've seen anything to this level in the NT. I come from a family of people who work in community and spend a lot of time working in the NT. The amount of people that have been out on the streets talking about this for traditional owners, they really are taking it seriously, and we really want to make sure that the government and this inquiry is committed to listening to us. So that's all from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up your presentation to the panel, but can I just start off with the remote communities which you think we should visit but are not listed in the background and issues paper? Which ones have we missed?
We really feel like you should visit Elliot.
Yes.
That you should visit the Hodgson Downs as well. We have some others, but
no, go for it.
I can actually just give them to you later.
All right, that sounds good. If you could send that to the task force, who are
the
sitting
other thing
right
I wanted
over
to
there,
say
would
is
be really good.
We know that we jumped around about a bunch of information, but we do intend
right.
to put in a report that has a lot of, links to different where this evidence is coming from as well.
Excellent. Thank you. That would be very, very useful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. No. Dr. Beck.
Just to follow up immediately on that point, because you said you're going to provide some further information. You did make mention during your presentation that in the United States people have to leave their country, and you're obviously concerned about possible implications for that in Australia. So if you've got any information references to that particular off-country movement, then that'd be particularly useful. Thanks very much.
We did actually, someone had people come out here from Wyoming as well and explain what had happened to them as well.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but we can do that.
Thank you. Sorry, I saw some more hands go up here. Dr. Ritchie.
Thank you. Just two things really. There's one just to reassure you that the committee completely understands that Aboriginal people in all the areas proposed for fracking are actually landowners.
Yep.
So they have not only, it's not just they have a right as landowners to be completely involved in a number of very important rights, one of which is to protect places that are culturally significant. The question I'd like to ask though is that I got the impression that you felt that notwithstanding those rights, the native title representative body, either the Northern Lands Council or the Central Lands Council, because it sort of straddles this part of the world, that there had been some at least perceived inadequacies in the way that had been that the actual traditional owners had been supported. Is that something that you feel that the committee should follow up?
Yeah, I really do. There's a lot of examples of it that I could touch on, even through the process of what we're here in Tennant Creek, but at the moment Gemini is talking to traditional owners, and today in the paper an article has come out on ABC with the Land Trust talking about the fact that they weren't told that fracking was going to go through this pipeline. They're very worried about the impacts of fracking, and they feel like that people have been dishonest with them. I think that this panel can really, shine a light on the fact that this process hasn't been done properly, and that maybe, I don't know how it's fixed through the land councils and that sort of stuff, but more resourcing needs to go into, or some sort of quality assurance about what is being said to. But the fact that there's no translators and that sort of thing in communities as well is a huge issue. But just a lot of the companies have also said that they can't explain to people because you can't explain upfront what the shale gas field will look like over the MacArthur Basin. But that doesn't mean that you don't explain to people what a shale gas field is, and that's what's been happening. Okay,
that's good. Thank you.
Yes, Jane Gorham.
Going back to the panel's consultations with the sort of particularly the remote communities, do you think there's been enough time allowed for consultation in this process? Because we've heard some other people suggest that there isn't enough time for word to get around and people to consider the issues.
I think that there hasn't been enough time to get... it typically takes us, once we're actually in a community, a week to bring people together, to let people know, to make sure we've got all the people that we need there. And so it's a little bit of actually going before a meeting and making sure people are aware about it. People have limited connectivity to phones and internet and that sort of stuff. And so when you're in that space, you don't typically know what day it is. Do you know what I mean? So for us to go into communities, we need to do a lot of prep work, and I think that it's not good enough to just rely on MLAs to send out through their offices to put, you're dealing with people that have low literacy levels, and you're dealing with communities that may not even speak English. So is the material, is the awareness able to get to them in their language that they're speaking is a huge issue and a huge barrier. I think also that the panel should actually work with organisations that actually are good and have shown that they are proven to work with communities, like health centres and that sort of stuff. That's a very easy way to let people know that stuff is happening in their communities, like Centrelink. Those are organisations that people come into contact with when they're living in remote communities. And so we think that that could be better, but also in terms of actually when you're going out into community, making sure I know that you will have translators because I asked the other day, but making sure that people are aware what sort of information that you're asking for, because the issues report it's big and it's been extended and it's great, but people don't know that these are the things that they need to talk to, and I think that's okay. If you're not allowing people to speak to the things that you're actually looking at, then that's a huge issue. And then maybe you seem like you could leave a community oh, they're okay with it. But actually, if you asked about a bunch of other things, they would not agree with those things. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, thanks. I've just got a question following up your comment about how little progress there has been in closing the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. And just wondering what your thoughts on if all the concerns that you talked about now were addressed, and if the gas industry were to proceed, and part of that was a commitment to reinvest funds into Indigenous communities to help close the gap, what are your thoughts on how that should happen? What should be done?
I have a lot of feelings about this. I think generally where we are right now is actually making the problem worse. So right now, anything that needs to go into remote communities, whether it's health, housing or education, sporting, all these things rely heavily on mining, and that creates a power dynamic. So if you're asking people, if people need basic services and you're saying that they're going to get them from the mining industry, then what you're asking them to do is weigh these basic services up for this type of jobs on country. We know that we've seen reports over and over again say that the royalties that come from mining into communities are usually heavily controlled by mining companies, and that's not a good thing. We've seen that create divisions in community. I think that what we need to see more is, we say this, we work as a climate organisation, and we say that we need to keep all new fossil fuels in the ground, but when we go out into communities, we absolutely, as young Aboriginal people, understand economic disadvantage. We never go into communities saying we're anti-mining. We don't talk badly about mobs that accept mining on country because we know we need that money to come in. We understand the complexity there. But the fracking industry, from my personal perspective, is too risky. And I think that it's not proven in Australia. Why are you taking the risk on our remote communities to see whether it works? I don't think it should be tested in the Northern Territory because these are our most vulnerable communities. There are issues here that are going to be exacerbated because of these mining, because of climate change. So I think it's just one of those things where you have to draw a hard line. There are royalties from mining, but I don't think that that's going to close the gap. I don't think that can be... For my mind, I think that what needs to happen is that governments actually need to involve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the process, because right now people are doing things to us, not with us, and that is why a lot of these programs on the ground aren't working.
Also, like, there's no other community in Australia who has to make the choice between, like, basic education, health and housing, only at the expense of selling their land off and destroying their country. Like, that is presented as the only option to Aboriginal people, and that's just not fair.
Yeah. And we also, like, from a perspective, we're a climate organisation, but because we didn't come into the Northern Territory with a stance of wanting a ban on fracking. We do support a ban on fracking. We got there because communities have said time and time again they just want it banned. They don't want to be humbugged by these companies who keep coming out and saying no. We know if you have a land trust, you can say no to someone and then they can't come back for 6 years. But if you have native title agreements, then the next company that comes along that wants to frack, you have to do this process all over and over again, and it's not fair.
Can I just ask everybody to speak up a bit? I just got a text that they can't hear on the live stream.
We are having technical difficulties, I think, due to the mobile coverage, which keeps dropping in and out, which I think everybody in this room has currently been experiencing. And I understand that's a problem that's been ongoing now for a period of days, and there's not much we can do about that, I'm afraid.
No worries.
Thank you.
Someone was telling me they can see everything, but they can't hear a bloody word.
Sorry, there was another question? Anything further? Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming today and presenting.